Call of the Wild is the story of Buck, a domestic dog, dog-napped from his happy home in California and transported to the Yukon to be in service as a member of a dog team. And his life is hard. The job is hard. His life is hard. He's not necessarily treated as well as he might be until he finds himself in the hands of John Thornton, the character that I play. The relationship between Buck and John Thornton begins accidentally in Skagway, when in midst of being bumped in a crowd and jostled by Buck, the dog, Buck notices that John has lost a harmonica, which he picks up in his mouth and takes to John. And that's the beginning of their relationship. When we were shooting the film, we didn't have Buck. Buck was still being manufactured in the computer lab. And we had, instead, a very talented actor named Terry Notary, who stood in for Buck. And the relationship between Buck and John Thornton was a relationship between myself and Terry Notary, who is he's an ex Cirque du Soleil performer, gymnast. So he was able to replicate the movement and the feeling of a dog for the photography, for the actors, to help block scenes, to create movement, and to give us something to look at, which wasn't there. One of the key emotional satisfactions of the story is that Buck, who has suffered at the hand of man, finds a new life in the wild. And we, having seen what he's been through, what he's endured, celebrate his new freedom and understanding of another way of life. I've had dogs all my life. They're all different. They have personalities. And they have one has a different relationship with each dog according to his personality. I suppose some of it comes from breed, some of it comes from nature, some of it comes from nurture or the experience he's had in his life. But dogs don't talk. And so you really have your emotional experience with the dog is based on what they need and what you can give them. You can give them food, you can give them affection, you can give them companionship, you can help keep them safe. And they, in turn, will be loyal to you. They will love you. It's that simple. As much as the story is about the character I play, John Thornton's rescuing Buck, Buck is actually instrumental in the recovery of John Thornton, the rescue of John Thornton from his past, and allows him to lift himself above his past, regain his own respect for himself, and to go back into the life he once lived and set things straight.
I got a call actually from Ryan Stafford, who I'd worked with on Planet of the Apes, and he said, we're doing this film called Call of the Wild. And I was instantly sold by knowing the book and having grown up, reading it and loving the story. And I said, well, what is it that you want me to do? And he said, play Buck. And I said, I'm in. It was pretty simple. One of the most fun moments for me in this film was when I was acting alongside Harrison Ford at that moment, and he looked at me, and I felt that I understood his own excitement and his emotion of becoming free and to just go on this blind journey. He's got 3 stages pretty much in the film, where he starts off as this big sloppy puppy that is just washing through the space and unaware of his the space he takes up, and there's just this abandonment and oblivion to anything else but food and comfort, right? And so everything is sort of disjointed and loose and just in this state of sort of abandoned bliss. And then when he gets captured, all of that sort of comes to a halt, a screeching halt, and he's thrown into this world where he's in a state of shock almost, where he's like, it's like grow up today or die. And that's the beginning of his growing period. That's the beginning of the growth of the character. When I first got the job, within an hour, I was filming my dogs in the front yard running around. I was getting them to run and then trot and then walk, and I was filming them in slow motion on my iPhone, and watching that and going, oh wow, this is completely different than apes move, and I've done a lot of ape movement, so it was like same arm, arms in opposition. Well, dogs, when they walk, there's they walk with same arm, same leg, so it's very different. And the arms there's no articulation in the front arms, so they're quite limited in the way they actually reach, and so there's a lot of pulling from underneath the body. When Harrison was acting alongside me or to me, I was trying to become the best listener I could by allowing his inflection and his emotions, his subtleties affect me, and then give me a feeling. And from that feeling, I would understand. So I was understanding feelings rather than words.
My dad used to talk about this book, and when I was little, he told me that it was the best story he ever read, but I never read it myself, and for some reason I somehow avoided it in school. It's like so much like required reading so much of the time in so many places, but I never read it until I began this project, and then I finally cracked the book open and read it and was very moved. It's an amazing book. It's not a fairy tale. It's a story. It's a gritty story. It's a story of survival, perseverance, and I think that it's a story that anybody can relate to, because whether you're young or old, I think you either have experienced things or you sense that there's a truth inside this story that you might be living yourself. No movie that has ever been done has ever attempted to do the entire book. This is the first time the book from beginning to end has ever been attempted. And one of the reasons we're able to actually attempt that is that now we can animate all the animal characters. I think it couldn't be a better time for people to rediscover this story. I think that there's a lot of stressful things going on, and there's a lot of uncertainty. And the neat thing about this character of Buck is how he faces those challenges and comes out of them better than he went in. One of the things I was charged with is telling the whole story, but also telling it for a family audience. We want to make sure, and that's one of the things I've done. I've worked for Disney and DreamWorks, and you just make sure that you don't exclude any audience member. We want to make sure that if anybody comes in and they're younger or if they're older, everybody they'll get something out of the story on their particular level. Harrison Ford is playing John Thornton. That is the last character that owns Buck. He doesn't really own Buck. He's a companion. He's the guy that brings Buck to his final destination, and they're more companions. The relationship that they share is more of a father and a son, and Buck plays the role of a child that Thornton had lost, and Thornton is able to take Buck on this final journey that he'd always dreamed of taking his son, and he completes that journey. In the book, Thornton goes through different situations with Buck, but I don't think his character is super well defined. And I think one of the wonderful things that Harrison did throughout this whole process was he was able to find that character, create that character, and really define what it was going to be. Omar Sy and Kara G, they just have such light and warmth and humor, and they've got a great chemistry between them. They're partners in this whole thing. And I think Francoise is much more practical. And Perrault is much more, I think, just maybe emotional and a little bit more impetuous. And the whole thing starts because he goes down to this dog cellar and he's supposed to come back with 2 dogs. And instead, he comes back with a dog that's 2 times too big. And that's Buck. Dan Stevens is fantastic because he is our Hal. And Hal is this rather wealthy man who's looking for some gold, brings his family along, and he's completely ill-prepared for what he's about to embark on. And everyone takes one look at him, including Buck, and they realize, oh no, this isn't going to work out. This is going to end very, very badly. And it does. He brings great character and energy to this villainous role. And last time we screened the film, we got a real cheer when Buck and he had to face off at the end, and it was really neat. But he does such a wonderful job, and he was so, so wonderful to work with. Did such a great job being our villain, Hal. He's one of my favorite actors, and I was so excited to finally meet him and work with him just a little bit. He is Buck's original owner, and he loves Buck unconditionally. And I think the unspoken thing is that he's probably indulged Buck just a little bit. I think Buck is a little spoiled, and he has the run of the town, and people just give him the room that he needs to do whatever he's going to do, and they tolerate him and stuff like that. So he's a real nice guy. He's a nice guy, and Bradley Whitford, he's did a great job. Janusz Kaminski, I had always dreamed of meeting him and working with him someday, but I finally got to meet him and got to actually work with him, and he is so energetic. I was so impressed with the amount of energy that he would bring to the set every single day. Right away, he was on it. He was talking about different shots, why he wanted to shoot things a certain way. I learned a ton about just the way he would approach a scene. Every scene he would approach with a very methodical, very, very smart way of doing things, so that by the end of the day, we really had everything we needed by the end of the day. Which was, for me, one of my greatest stresses. In animation, you sit around and go, well, we need this and that, and you just, in a sense, you keep shooting the entire time until you ultimately, just run out of time, and you just shoot for years. But you have only a certain amount of time to get a certain thing, and seeing how he would get that, watching him light, and watching him take a set from the way we saw it when we first walked onto it cold to just being, filled with life and laughter and characters interacting and moving around and stuff like that. It's really, really incredible. Just very impressive.
The way the story's been written and laid out, it is definitely from Buck's point of view. Now, along the way, Buck interacts with some just world-class actors, and Bradley Whitford and Omar Sy and Dan Stevens and then Harrison Ford in that story order. So keeping the shots about Buck and keeping the point of view of each scene from Buck's point of view, I think will allow you to track his storyline all the way through. One of the things that we took a major evolutionary step on was, instead of just having a marker for where Buck is to be, a tennis ball or what have you, we decided to actually put a real person in there. We hired Terry Notary, who's one of the premier motion specialists in the movie industry, and we have him playing Buck. So he spent many hours studying dogs and learning their mannerisms and practicing their mannerisms, and he has then brought those mannerisms and the emotionality of the main character to the set. With the overarching goal of everything being completely in dead photo real, it will be the most beautiful version of real that you'll have ever seen. It's going to be the most idyllic day in the Yukon. It's going to be the most perfect sunset over the Napa Valley. It is going to be this storybook quality to hold this just magical vision for the story to take place, that's going to be intercut with sets and photography that have also had the storybook vision applied to it. So the two will just blend together beautifully to make this heightened reality. We're already preparing some steps to take to make sure that we are matching Janusz's lighting and Janusz's camera movements. So I'll break down the two segments, Janusz and cinematography, and then Stefan and production design. So with cinematography, we are taking significant lighting references of every single setup that we do. Every single setup, we walk the gray balls and the chrome balls through the camera and the lighting. And then we walk a dog that closely resembles the coloration of Buck through the lighting. And then we also take HDRIs and this process called round shots, and we know where every light is, we know the intensity and value of every single light and every single shot, and we're able to replicate that exactly. Everybody's going to find a piece of themselves in Buck. Buck starts off the movie as a kid, and throughout he goes through adolescence and then into adulthood and becoming the leader. So I think everybody's going to be able to relate to that. Everybody's going to find a piece of Buck that they find in themselves. He's not just a dog, he is our main character, and his arc is complex and has many layers, and I think that his journey will be just one that for the ages.
I started to look at animation directors because we then realized somebody has to really understand how to create a character out of nothing in Buck, both visually and so on, and somebody had to have that training. And I started to look at those directors, and the guy that jumped out at me was Chris Sanders. And I sat with, Chris came in to meet with me, and within 10 or 15 minutes, it became completely clear to me that he was the director for the movie. The thing that was so remarkable about the whole experience with Chris is that everything about his personal sensibility and kind of his emotional sensibility and so on was right for this movie. And the most important task that a director had to have in order to make this movie, and that's what I found out in the process of looking for directors, was somebody who had the technical capabilities, which an animation director and an illustrator like Chris has, is to create a emotionally compelling character out of nothing. So that's what Chris brought to it in terms of his whole animation background. The emotion exists in the DNA of the book, but what Michael was really able to do was to change enough and accentuate enough to make it cinematic and to make it really come out. Because the hardest part of it is that the hero journey that Buck endures and goes through and experiences, any hero journey has some tough moments in it. And what Michael always knew how to do was to take you through those and at the end make you realize how those tough moments had created the character that you so loved. I think one of the genius moves in terms of the casting of this movie was Omar Sy. I, from the beginning, said I really want someone who's a native French speaker to play this role. Just because I have a acute ear for accents, and I didn't want a phony sounding French accent. I wanted a real French person. And so Denise, the only person we ever saw for the role was Omar. Denise brought him in, and it was an absolutely genius move because Omar's understanding of the character and sort of his innate warmth was so right. His innate warmth and his innate charm was just so right for the role of Perot. You could just see how this is a guy who would fall for Buck and this odd mixture of dogs that he put together, which is the team that's ultimately led by Buck. One of the great gifts of this whole experience was, and this was really Ryan Stafford's idea, was to bring in Terry Notary, who was a Cirque du Soleil artist, in the course of shooting, to play Buck. And it was an odd idea, frankly, at first, that I didn't know how Harrison Ford would react to it. I thought it was potentially kind of silly because you've got a grown man who's on all fours, and he sort of constructed these prosthetic front legs, who's on all fours in a funny gray suit playing a dog. It turned out to be a genius move because Terry gives such a committed performance that it has improved every actor's performance in the course of the movie, because otherwise these actors would just be acting against empty space. The technology that we're using is really the most cutting edge technology, because we're not using motion capture. We're using true CG, computer graphic technology, to create a photo real experience.